Most people don't lose because they're weak. They lose because they're predictable. That's the uncomfortable thing nobody tells you early enough. You can be smart, competent, hardworking, and genuinely decent, and still watch situations go sideways in ways you can't quite explain. Not because you failed at the obvious stuff, but because there was a layer of what was happening that you weren't reading. At some point, most people have a moment like this. Something happens at work, or in a friendship, or in a room full of people making decisions. And you walk away with that strange feeling. Not quite anger. More like the sensation of having lost a game you didn't know you were playing. That feeling is important. Most people either suppress it or let it make them cynical. But there's a third option. Use it as a starting point. This book is about the psychology underneath ordinary interactions. The patterns that shape outcomes before anyone says anything definitive. The quiet mechanics of how influence actually works. Not in a dramatic, villainous sense, but in the small, persistent, deeply human ways that people protect their position, shape perception, and respond to pressure. Some of what you'll read will feel uncomfortably familiar. You'll recognize situations you've been in. You may also recognize things you've done, not maliciously, but automatically, because that's what humans do under pressure. The goal isn't to make you paranoid. Paranoid people see threat in everything and end up more reactive, not less. The goal is precision. The ability to read what's actually happening, pause before responding, and move through difficult human dynamics without burning energy on the wrong things. Quiet people win more than you think. Not because they're passive, because they're watching while everyone else is reacting. That's where we start. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The game no one tells you exists. Nobody hands you a manual when you enter a room. But a few people in that room definitely have one. You don't notice it immediately. The room looks normal. People are talking, laughing, being professionally pleasant. Someone asks about your weekend. Someone else refills their coffee. Everything appears ordinary. But underneath the small talk, something else is running. Quieter, older, and considerably less polite than the conversation on the surface. This isn't cynicism. It's just how human beings actually work. We are social creatures, yes. Cooperative, empathetic, capable of genuine warmth. But we are also deeply status-aware in ways that most of us prefer not to examine too closely. Every social environment, a workplace, a family, a friend group, a meeting room, has an invisible hierarchy. And people are constantly, mostly unconsciously, navigating it. Protecting their position, signaling their value, watching to see who's rising and who isn't. Most of this happens below the level of conscious strategy. People aren't sitting at home plotting. They're just responding to the same pressure every human responds to. The need to feel secure, relevant, and not replaceable. But that doesn't make the dynamics less real, and it doesn't make the effects less significant. Here's what the game actually looks like in practice. It rarely looks like conflict. Open conflict is expensive. It's visible. It creates enemies. It requires energy. So people who are skilled at this don't operate openly. They operate through small adjustments. A comment dropped into a conversation at exactly the right moment. A piece of information shared with one person but not another. A story told in a particular way, with a particular emphasis, that quietly shifts how the listener sees a situation. None of these moves look dramatic in isolation. That's the point. Each one is deniable. Each one seems like ordinary conversation. But cumulatively, over time, they shape perception. And perception, in human environments, is often more powerful than reality. I watched this happen to someone I genuinely respected. He was competent, reliable, the kind of person who did the actual work while others talked about doing it. Over about 6 months, almost nothing changed on the surface, but something subtle was shifting. A framing here, a slight emphasis there. By the time anyone noticed, the story people told about him had quietly changed, and the story had nothing to do with his actual performance. He never saw it coming because he was focused on the work, not the room. The people who get confused by this dynamic are usually the ones who were taught a version of the world where fairness is the operating principle. Work hard, be honest, do the right thing. And that belief isn't wrong, exactly. In many situations, those qualities matter enormously. But they don't immunize you against a game you're not tracking, because the game doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up wearing a sign. It shows up as a slightly odd comment at a meeting. It shows up as a story that gets told about you when you're not in the room. It shows up as a decision that was apparently already made by the time you arrived. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most of the people running these dynamics aren't aware they're doing it. Some are. But the majority are operating on instinct, the same territorial, status-protecting instincts that have been shaping human behavior for a very long time. They're not villains. They're just more tuned in to the hidden layer than you are, which means the solution isn't to find the villains and expose them. That approach almost always backfires. You look paranoid. You create enemies. You spend enormous energy fighting something that was never meant to be fought directly. The solution is simpler and considerably harder. Learn to see the layer. Once you can see it, the emotional charge disappears almost immediately. What felt personal, once you can see it, the emotional charge disappears almost immediately. What felt personal starts to feel structural. What felt like an attack starts to feel like a pattern, and patterns are manageable. Patterns can be navigated. Patterns can even, if you're patient enough, be used. The first step is observation. Not suspicious observation, not scanning every room for enemies. Just genuine attention to what's actually happening beneath the surface conversation. Watch how people behave when something shifts. When someone new gets attention, who becomes quieter? When credit is distributed, who positions themselves closest to it? When a mistake happens, who moves away from it fastest and who gets left holding it? Human behavior becomes remarkably legible under those conditions. Not because people are simple, but because the pressures driving them are consistent. Status, security, relevance, the same few forces playing out in slightly different configurations in every room you'll ever sit in. You don't need to respond to any of it immediately. In fact, the best thing you can do at first is nothing. Just watch. Let the pattern reveal itself. Most people are so focused on managing their own position that they're barely aware of being observed at all. That's the first real advantage. Not strength, not charisma, not even intelligence. Just the willingness to look at what's actually in front of you without flinching and without rushing to react. The game exists. It's been running the whole time. The only question is whether you're going to keep being surprised by it or start paying attention. Chapter 2. Why smart people melt down first. Smart people are actually easier to manipulate. They explain themselves. That's the part nobody warns you about. Intelligence is genuinely useful in most areas of life. It helps you solve problems, anticipate consequences, understand complexity. But in emotionally charged social situations, intelligence has a specific failure mode, and it fails in a very particular, very recognizable way. It makes you argue, not aggressively, necessarily, intelligently, logically. with evidence and structure and a clear narrative of what actually happened. And that's precisely the problem. Because the moment you begin carefully explaining your position, you've already accepted the wrong premise. You've accepted that this is a situation where the best argument wins. It usually isn't. Here's what actually happens in most social conflicts. Two people disagree. One of them feels threatened or embarrassed or challenged. At that point, the situation stops being about facts. It becomes about something much older and less rational, the need to not lose face. And once that switch flips, logic becomes almost entirely irrelevant. You can be completely right. You can have documentation. You can walk through the timeline step by step with perfect clarity. And the other person will still not update their position, because their position was never really about the facts. It was about how they feel. And feelings don't yield to spreadsheets. The intelligent person's mistake is assuming that if they just explain clearly enough, the situation will resolve. So they keep going. They add more context. They address the counter-arguments. They become increasingly precise, increasingly thorough, and increasingly frustrated, because the clarity they're offering isn't landing. Meanwhile, something else is happening that they're not tracking. Every additional explanation signals investment. Every clarification signals that this situation matters to them deeply, personally, and to everyone watching, because there is almost always an audience. That signal is louder than the content of the argument itself. They don't look right. They look rattled. I made this mistake in a situation I'd rather not revisit in detail. Someone had framed a shared project in a way that quietly erased my contribution. I responded with a very thorough, very well-organized account of what had actually happened. Accurate. Completely accurate. Also completely ineffective. The correction itself became the story, not the original misrepresentation. I handed them a narrative I didn't intend to hand them. The alternative, the one I understood too late, was to say almost nothing in that moment. Let the misrepresentation sit. Watch who nodded, who didn't, who was paying real attention. Then, much later, in a smaller conversation, with one or two people whose perception actually mattered, say exactly what needed to be said. Quietly. Once. But that requires something most intelligent people find genuinely difficult: tolerating the discomfort of being misunderstood in public without immediately correcting it. That discomfort is where most smart people break, because intelligent people tend to have a particular relationship with accuracy. Being wrong, or being perceived as wrong, produces a specific kind of internal friction that's hard to sit with. It feels urgent. It feels like something that must be addressed immediately, before the misperception hardens. And that urgency is exactly what makes them predictable. Once someone knows that inaccuracy provokes you, they have a lever. They don't even need to be strategic about using it. They just need to say something slightly wrong about you in front of other people and wait. You'll do the rest yourself. This is why emotional discipline matters more than intellectual firepower in these situations. Not because your argument is wrong, but because the timing and manner of how you respond shapes perception more powerfully than the content of what you say. Think about how this plays out in a meeting. Someone takes credit for an idea you introduced earlier. The intelligent response feels obvious. Point out what happened. Restore the record. But watch what actually occurs when someone does this. The room doesn't think, "Ah, yes, justice restored." The room thinks, "Why is this person so bothered about credit?" Which makes the person correcting look smaller, not larger. The composed response, the one that actually works, is to say nothing in that moment. To let the idea succeed. and then, at a later point, to reference it naturally in a way that makes your involvement obvious without making it contested. No argument, no correction, just presence. That's harder than it sounds. It requires you to let something unfair happen without immediately fixing it. And for someone who values accuracy, that feels almost physically uncomfortable. But here's what that discomfort is protecting you from missing. The situation is not about the idea. It was never about the idea. It's about who appears calm, who appears confident, and who appears like they have more important things to focus on than this. The person who stays quiet in that moment answers all three. There's a deeper pattern here worth sitting with. Emotional reactions don't just reveal your feelings, they reveal your priorities. When you respond intensely to something, you're telling everyone in the room what you care about, what threatens you, what you're protecting. Skilled observers collect this information automatically. They're not even trying. They're just watching who responds to what and filing it away. The strategist does the same thing, but deliberately. They don't react to provocation because they're busy reading what the provocation reveals. Who initiated it? What outcome they seemed to want? Whether it was calculated or reflexive. Each reaction in the room is a piece of information, but only the person who isn't reacting gets to collect it. Intelligence is a tool. Like any tool, its value depends entirely on when you use it and when you put it down. In a room full of people responding to pressure with their emotions, the most powerful thing an intelligent person can do is go quiet. Watch. Let others explain themselves. Let the situation unfold long enough to actually understand it. Then, when the moment is right, say the one thing that needed to be said. Clearly. Calmly. Once. That's it. That's the whole move. And it is, almost without exception, more effective than everything you would have said in the first 5 minutes combined. You're still here. 2 chapters in. That's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3. How to read what people aren't saying. Forget what people say. Watch what they do when they think the stakes are low. That's where the real information lives. Not in the carefully constructed sentences people offer when they know they're being evaluated. Not in the performance of professionalism during important meetings, or the warmth people display when they want something. The honest data is in the small moments, the unguarded ones, the ones people don't think anyone is paying attention to. Most people believe they're decent observers of human behavior. They're not. What they're actually doing is listening to words and forming impressions based on tone and facial expression, which is useful, but shallow. It tells you how someone wants to be perceived in this moment. It tells you almost nothing about who they actually are. Genuine observation is different. It's slower, it's less dramatic, and it requires paying attention to things that don't seem important until they suddenly are. Here's a simple example. Watch how someone treats a person who can't do anything for them. The waiter, the assistant, the person who holds the door. Most people calibrate their behavior, consciously or not, based on perceived status. They're warmer to people above them and cooler to people below. They don't notice they're doing it. But it's one of the most reliable behavioral signals available. The person who is genuinely decent treats everyone with roughly the same basic respect, regardless of what they can offer. Not identically, context shapes interaction. but the floor doesn't drop. And when you find someone whose floor drops significantly, depending on who's in front of them, you've learned something important. Not that they're a bad person necessarily, that they're status-driven in a way they haven't examined, and status-driven people behave predictably under pressure. Watch what happens when credit gets distributed. This is one of the most revealing moments in any group environment. When something goes well, observe who moves toward the credit and how fast. Watch whether they acknowledge others or absorb the moment entirely. Then watch what happens when something goes wrong. Who steps forward and who finds somewhere else to be. The gap between those two behaviors tells you more about someone's character than years of pleasant conversation. Watch how people handle being interrupted. Some people pause, let the interruption run its course, and continue. Some people stop entirely and defer. Some people talk over the interruption without acknowledging it happened. Each response is a data point, not a verdict. One moment doesn't define anyone, but patterns across multiple moments start to form a picture. Watch how people talk about people who aren't in the room. This one is particularly useful. When someone consistently speaks poorly of absent people, they're giving you a preview. They're showing you the version of you that exists in conversations you're not part of. They're also showing you something about how they process threat, because most chronic criticism of others is less about the people being criticized and more about the speaker's need to manage their own sense of standing. I spent about 2 years working alongside someone who was impressively charming in group settings. Funny, warm, the kind of person everyone immediately liked. I noticed early on that his stories about other people, colleagues, old friends, previous bosses, always ended with those people looking slightly diminished. Not viciously, just subtly. Every anecdote had a quiet punchline at someone else's expense. I filed it away and said nothing. About 18 months later, I heard a version of one of his stories that featured me. Same structure, same quiet punchline. I wasn't surprised. The preview had been accurate. This is the core value of observation over time. Individual moments are ambiguous. Patterns are not. Anyone can be generous once. Anyone can be patient once. Anyone can appear calm in a single situation. But consistency across different conditions, different stakes, different audiences, that's character. And character, unlike performance, doesn't vary based on who's watching. The other thing to observe carefully is what people avoid. Omission is as informative as action. Notice which topics someone consistently steers around. Notice which questions they answer with a question. Notice which mistakes they acknowledge, and which ones they never quite address directly. What someone refuses to look at directly tells you where their discomfort lives. And discomfort, under pressure, becomes behavior. There's a particular kind of observation that takes practice. Watching the gap between someone's stated values and their actual choices. Most people have a version of themselves they sincerely believe in. Hardworking, fair, honest, loyal. And in many situations, they live up to it. But pressure is a stress test. When something genuinely costs them, status, comfort, convenience, credit, which version shows up? The sincere one or the convenient one? You can't know this from a single conversation. You can't know it from how someone presents themselves. You can only know it by watching long enough to see the pressure arrive. The mistake most people make is forming strong impressions too quickly. They meet someone, have a good interaction, and decide they understand them. But a single interaction only shows you one configuration of a person. It shows you them under these specific conditions, with these specific stakes, on this particular day. It tells you almost nothing about how they'll behave when the conditions change. Withhold your conclusions. Not forever. At some point, patterns are patterns, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of naivety. But give situations time to develop. Give people enough rope to either behave consistently or reveal the gap between their performance and their instincts. One more thing worth noticing: how people respond to someone else's success. This is the sharpest test available. When a colleague gets recognized, when a friend lands something good, when someone in your orbit moves ahead, watch the room. Some people feel genuine warmth and show it. Some people feel discomfort and manage it gracefully. And some people feel something they can't quite name, and it shows in very small ways. A flatness in the congratulation, a pivot to something else too quickly, a comment that's supportive on the surface but contains, if you're listening carefully, a tiny needle. That needle tells you everything. Not because envy is a disqualifying flaw, it's one of the most human responses imaginable. But because how people handle it determines whether they're someone you can trust when your own success arrives. Someone who manages their discomfort and behaves well anyway is valuable. Someone who lets that discomfort quietly shape their behavior is a risk you now know about. None of this requires suspicion. It requires attention. The difference is significant. Suspicion poisons your own perception. It finds what it's looking for, whether it's there or not. Attention is neutral. It observes without agenda and lets the pattern speak. Most people are telling you exactly who they are, constantly, in the small moments they think don't matter. The only question is whether you're paying close enough attention to hear it. Chapter 4. The Invisible Architecture of Manipulation. The most effective manipulation never feels like manipulation. It feels like a reasonable conversation. That's what makes it work. If manipulation announced itself, if it arrived wearing an obvious costume, with a visible agenda and a clear warning sign, nobody would fall for it. It would be too easy to recognize and too easy to refuse. But the kind of manipulation that actually shapes outcomes in real environments doesn't look like anything. It looks like a colleague expressing mild concern. It looks like a helpful suggestion. It looks like someone simply sharing information. By the time you feel the effect, the move has already been made. Understanding how this works is not about becoming cynical or treating every interaction as a covert operation. It's about developing the ability to recognize structural patterns, the mechanics behind certain kinds of influence, so that when they appear, you're not experiencing them blind. The first pattern is what psychologists call doubt introduction. It almost never looks aggressive. Someone doesn't attack your credibility directly. That would be too visible, too risky. Instead, they introduce a small question, a concern, something that sounds responsible and measured on the surface. I might be completely wrong, but I've noticed something that's been bothering me. Or, I'm sure there's a good explanation, but I wanted to flag this before it became an issue. Notice the structure. Nothing is claimed directly. No accusation is made. But a question has been placed in the listener's mind, and questions are sticky. The human brain doesn't handle uncertainty comfortably. Once doubt exists, it tends to search for evidence to resolve itself. And in that searching, it often finds things it wasn't looking for before. The doubt does its work quietly, long after the conversation ends. The second pattern is narrative reframing. This one is subtle enough that it works even on people who consider themselves perceptive. The facts of a situation remain unchanged. What shifts is the frame around them, the emphasis, the emotional tone, the context that's included or excluded. Two people describe the same project outcome. One says, "We took an unconventional approach and learned things that will make the next attempt significantly stronger." The other says, We deviated from the plan, and the result wasn't what the client expected. Both statements describe the same reality. But the first positions the team as adaptive and forward-thinking. The second positions them as unreliable. Neither person has lied, but they've created completely different impressions. And the impression that gets repeated, that gets carried into the next conversation, that shapes how decision-makers think about this team, that's the one that was framed more persuasively. Reality lost to narrative. It happens constantly. The third pattern involves selective visibility, controlling what gets noticed by controlling what gets emphasized. Human attention is finite and easily directed. If you repeat something often enough, people begin to treat it as significant regardless of its actual weight. If you consistently highlight one aspect of a situation while quietly ignoring another, the audience eventually sees only what you've been showing them. Imagine a team that completes 12 projects successfully and stumbles on one. A person using selective visibility doesn't need to fabricate anything. They simply talk about the one failure, regularly, thoughtfully, with genuine seeming concern. Over time, that single failure becomes the dominant data point in how the team is perceived. The 12 successes don't disappear. They just stop being mentioned, and things that aren't mentioned stop being remembered. The fourth pattern is emotional positioning. Perhaps the most elegant of the group because it uses someone else's natural reactions against them. The mechanic is simple. You remain calm while provoking someone else into reacting. Then you allow the contrast to do its work. You don't need to say anything damaging. You don't need to make any accusation. You simply ask a pointed question in a setting where the other person feels challenged, and then you wait. If they respond with visible frustration, which is a completely reasonable human response to being challenged, the audience reads the emotional contrast, not the content. You appear composed. They appear unstable. The actual substance of the exchange becomes irrelevant. This is why emotional discipline isn't just internally useful. It's structurally protective. The moment you become visibly reactive, you've handed someone a tool they didn't have to work to earn. The fifth pattern is timing manipulation, using the when of information rather than the what. Technically, all relevant information gets shared, but it gets shared at a moment when responding to it is no longer practical. Important details arrive the night before a decision. Concerns are raised after the window for addressing them has closed. The appearance of transparency is maintained. Everything was disclosed, but the disclosure was engineered to prevent any meaningful response. This one is particularly difficult to counter in the moment, because the defense, "You told me too late for it to matter," sounds like complaining, which is, of course, part of the design. Now, a necessary interruption. Recognizing these patterns does not mean assuming they're present everywhere. Most conversations are exactly what they appear to be. Most people, in most moments, are not running a covert influence operation. They're just trying to manage their day. The goal of understanding these mechanics is not to turn you into someone who sees threat in ordinary interaction. That kind of hypervigilance is its own form of distortion, and it makes you less effective, not more. The goal is pattern recognition. The ability to notice when the structure of an interaction has a particular shape, when doubt is being introduced without evidence, when a narrative is being selectively constructed, when someone's composure seems calibrated rather than genuine. Not to immediately react to it, but to see it. Because seeing it changes everything. When you recognize a manipulation tactic mid-conversation, something interesting happens internally. The emotional charge drains out of the situation almost immediately. What felt personal starts to feel mechanical. What felt threatening starts to feel like a pattern you've encountered before. and patterns are manageable. You stop needing to defend yourself against every move. You start asking different questions. What is the actual objective here? What outcome is this person trying to produce? What do they need me to believe, or feel, or do? Once you identify the objective, the specific tactic being used becomes almost secondary. You're no longer responding to the surface. You're responding, or choosing not to respond, to the structure. And structure, once visible, loses most of its power. The person who sees the architecture of an interaction clearly is almost impossible to manipulate effectively. Not because they're aggressive or defensive, because they're not confused. Manipulation depends on confusion. It depends on the target not quite understanding what's happening, responding to the surface rather than the mechanics, reacting emotionally while the other person stays one level above the chaos. Remove the confusion, and the entire mechanism stalls. You don't need to announce that you see it. You don't need to call it out dramatically or confront the person directly. In most situations, the most powerful response is simply to not give the move what it was designed to produce. Don't react emotionally when someone is engineering an emotional reaction. Don't let doubt live rent-free in your mind when no actual evidence supports it. Don't accept a narrative frame without quietly noticing that it's a frame. Just see it. Stay calm and decide deliberately what you actually want to do next. That deliberateness, that gap between stimulus and response, is where strategy lives. And strategy, in a room full of people reacting automatically, is a significant advantage. Chapter 5. Silence is not empty. The most important thing said in that room was nothing. There was a moment, a long pause after someone made a claim that didn't quite hold up. The room waited for a response. The person being challenged opened their mouth, then closed it. And in that silence, something shifted. Not dramatically, but everyone felt it. The claim quietly lost its weight without a single word being spoken against it. Most people would have argued. Most people would have felt the pressure of that silence and rushed to fill it with something. A correction, a defense, a reframing. The instinct to fill silence is almost physical. It feels like falling, like something urgent needs to happen to stop the discomfort. But silence was doing something that words couldn't. It was making space for the room to form its own conclusion. That's the thing about silence that almost nobody understands until they've experienced it working. It isn't passive. It isn't the absence of communication. It is a specific kind of communication, one that operates on a completely different frequency than words, and often carries far more signal. In a world that moves at the speed of immediate reaction, silence has become genuinely rare, which means it's also become genuinely powerful. When everyone around you is filling every available space with words, opinions, defenses, and responses, the person who doesn't becomes immediately conspicuous, not in a weak way, in a way that draws attention precisely because it refuses to perform. Think about the mechanics of a negotiation. Someone presents an offer. The other person says nothing, just waits. The silence sits in the room like an object, and almost immediately, the person who made the offer begins to experience it as inadequacy. They start explaining the offer, sweetening it, adding context that wasn't asked for, essentially negotiating against themselves, because the silence felt like disapproval and they couldn't tolerate the ambiguity. The person who stayed quiet didn't say a word. They didn't have to. This happens because silence forces the other person to project meaning onto it. And what people project is almost always their own anxiety, their own uncertainty about whether they've said enough, offered enough, performed well enough. The quiet person doesn't create that anxiety. They just refuse to relieve it. And in that refusal, they hold an enormous amount of power. Silence also does something to the rhythm of a conversation that's very difficult to replicate with words. It slows everything down. And when things slow down, the emotional momentum that was driving the exchange begins to dissipate. Arguments lose heat. Provocations lose traction. The person who was trying to force a reaction finds themselves waiting for one that isn't coming, and that waiting destabilizes them in ways they didn't anticipate. I learned this slowly, mostly by accident. I was in a conversation that was escalating in a direction I didn't want. My instinct was to keep matching the energy, responding to each point, correcting each mischaracterization, staying in it. Instead, something made me stop. I said nothing for what felt like a very long time. The other person kept going for a moment, then slowed, then stopped. The energy in the room changed completely. What had felt like a confrontation suddenly felt like one person talking and another person thinking. The dynamic shifted without a single argument being made. The strategic use of silence isn't about withholding, it's about choosing. Choosing when your words will carry the most weight. Choosing which moments deserve a response and which ones are better served by letting the space breathe. Every time you speak automatically, reactively, just to fill the gap, you dilute the value of everything else you say. But when you speak rarely and deliberately, people begin to pay attention in a different way. They lean in slightly. They treat your words as considered rather than reflexive. This is why the most respected voices in any room are rarely the most frequent ones. There's a particular silence that's worth mastering specifically. The pause before responding. Not a long pause. Sometimes just a breath. 2 seconds. Enough to signal that what was just said is being processed rather than simply bounced back. That pause does several things simultaneously. It communicates composure. It signals that you're thinking rather than reacting. It gives you actual time to consider what you want to say. And it subtly shifts the power balance of the exchange. Because the person who pauses before responding appears to be evaluating, and being evaluated is a different experience than being argued with. Compare that to someone who responds immediately to everything, instantly. Whatever the stimulus, the response appears within seconds. Watch how that person gets treated over time. People begin to see them as reactive, predictable, easy to read. And easy to read means easy to manage. The person who pauses is harder to read. And harder to read means harder to manipulate. Silence also functions as a kind of filter for other people's honesty. When you stop filling every gap with your own words, other people fill the gaps instead. And what people say when they're filling silence they find uncomfortable is often considerably more revealing than what they say when they've prepared their response. They over-explain. They contradict themselves. They volunteer information they would never have offered if the conversation had moved at normal speed. The quiet person collects all of this. The talkative person misses it entirely because they were busy formulating their next sentence. There's an important distinction between strategic silence and passive silence. Passive silence is the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say, who has retreated, who is simply absent from the conversation. That reads as uncertainty or disengagement. Strategic silence is deliberate presence without words. It's the silence of someone who is paying full attention and choosing not to speak. And the difference between them is visible. It lives in posture, in eye contact, in the quality of attention. One says, "I have nothing to offer." The other says, "I'm watching everything and I'll speak when I'm ready." The second is one of the most powerful positions available in any conversation. This takes practice because the discomfort of silence is real. When a pause extends, most people feel it as pressure, a social pressure to resolve the discomfort, to say something, to move the interaction forward. Learning to sit in that discomfort without flinching is genuinely difficult. It requires trusting that silence is doing something, even when it's hard to see what. But that trust is well placed, because in almost every interaction, the person who can tolerate silence longer than the other person holds a structural advantage. They are not beholden to the rhythm the other person sets. They don't need the conversation to resolve quickly. They can wait. And waiting, in the right moment, is one of the most powerful things a person can do. Words are tools. Used carefully, they're precise and effective. Used constantly, they become noise. Silence is the space where your words gain their weight. Use it. Chapter 6. The cost of fighting every fight. And some arguments exist only to exhaust you. That's the entire point. Not every conflict that finds you is about the thing it appears to be about. Some conflicts are genuinely about the issue on the surface, a real disagreement, a legitimate grievance, something that actually needs to be resolved. Those are worth engaging with. But a significant portion of the conflicts that arrive in your direction have a different function entirely. They're not designed to resolve anything. They're designed to consume you, your attention, your energy, your emotional bandwidth, your time. And the moment you step in, the moment you begin explaining, defending, correcting, engaging, the mechanism works. It doesn't matter whether you win the argument. The cost was the point. You spent resources on something that was never going to produce a useful outcome. And now those resources aren't available for something that would have. This is one of the most underappreciated dynamics in human interaction. People think about conflict in terms of winning and losing, but there's a third outcome that gets almost no attention: depleting. You can win an argument completely and still walk away depleted in ways that cost you more than the win was worth. You can be entirely right, entirely justified, entirely victorious, and still have handed someone exactly what they were after. The chess analogy is overused but remains accurate. An experienced player doesn't move every piece that could theoretically be moved. They don't attack every position that could theoretically be attacked. They conserve. They evaluate. They ask not just whether a move is possible, but whether it advances the position in a way that matters. Moves that don't advance the position, even aggressive-looking ones, are wasteful. Sometimes they're actively counterproductive. Most people approach conflict the way inexperienced chess players approach the board. Something threatens them, and they respond immediately, because responding feels like the right thing to do. It feels like strength. It feels like not letting things go unaddressed. But what it actually is, in many cases, is exactly what the situation was designed to produce: a reaction. The question that changes everything is a simple one, worth asking before almost every conflict. Does engaging with this actually matter? Not, am I right? You might be completely right. Not, is this fair? It might be profoundly unfair. But, does the outcome of this conflict change anything that actually matters to me? Sometimes the answer is yes. There are moments when staying silent allows something genuinely harmful to take root. When a boundary needs to be set clearly and visibly. When a narrative, left unchallenged, will harden into something that affects your position in lasting ways. Those moments require engagement, deliberate, well-timed, controlled engagement. But many other moments don't. A comment designed to provoke a reaction, A criticism offered in a setting where the real audience is the people watching how you respond. A minor misrepresentation that will be forgotten by tomorrow unless you make it memorable by arguing about it today. An old grievance being re-aired by someone who needs the emotional intensity more than they need the resolution. These don't require your engagement. They require your restraint. I got this wrong for years. My working theory was that leaving things unaddressed meant accepting them. That silence in the face of unfairness was a kind of complicity. So I engaged. Not aggressively, but thoroughly. Every mischaracterization got a correction. Every unfair criticism got a response. I was consistent, I was usually right, and I was exhausted in a way I didn't fully understand until I stopped. What I hadn't noticed was that my predictability had become a resource for other people. If you wanted my attention, you knew exactly how to get it. If you wanted to derail my focus, you had a reliable mechanism. I had handed people a lever and then complained that they kept pulling it. The person who reacts to everything is the easiest person in the room to manage. Not because they're weak, they might be formidably intelligent and completely right about everything, but because they're predictable. You know what will move them. You know what will pull their focus. You know how to make them spend their afternoon on something that benefits you more than it benefits them. The person who reacts selectively is much harder to work with in that way. You can't reliably provoke them. You don't know which moves will get a response and which ones will simply be observed and filed away. That unpredictability creates a kind of friction that discourages low-quality provocations in the first place. If pulling the lever doesn't produce a reaction, most people stop pulling it. There's also a reputational dimension to this. People who engage in every conflict, even when they're right, gradually acquire a specific identity in the minds of those around them. They become someone who gets into conflicts. That identity is sticky, and it's disproportionately harmful because it attaches to you regardless of the merits of any individual situation. It starts to color how people interpret your future behavior. Where others see legitimate pushback, they see a pattern. The person who chooses their engagements carefully acquires a different identity. When they do speak up, it carries weight precisely because it's not something they do constantly. The rarity of the response signals that this particular situation genuinely matters. People pay attention differently. This requires developing a fairly cold-eyed ability to evaluate conflicts in the moment, to feel the pull of the situation, and still ask whether engaging serves anything real. That evaluation has a few useful questions built into it. Will this matter in a week, a month, a year? Most things that feel urgent right now won't. The comment someone made in a meeting, the credit that went to the wrong person, the small slight that felt significant, most of these evaporate quickly in the normal flow of events. Responding to them in the moment locks them in. Letting them pass often dissolves them. Who is the actual audience? Some conflicts are private, some are effectively public performances. Knowing which one you're in changes the calculus entirely. A correction that makes sense in a private conversation may have completely different effects in front of an audience where people are watching the social dynamics more than listening to the content. What does engaging cost beyond the argument itself? Time is obvious. But also consider what engaging communicates about your priorities, what it signals about what threatens you, what it reveals about where your attention goes when it's pulled. What does not engaging actually cost? Sometimes the answer is very little. The situation resolves itself. The narrative doesn't harden. Nobody remembers by next week. Other times the cost of silence is real. Something important gets cemented that shouldn't be allowed to stand. Knowing the difference is the skill. The goal isn't to never engage. It's to engage when it matters and conserve when it doesn't. To treat your attention and your energy as finite resources that require as much strategic management as any other resource you have. Because every battle you don't fight is energy available for something worth fighting for. And the person who knows which battles those are, the person who can feel the pull of a provocation and consciously decide to let it pass. That person is operating at a level that most people never reach. Not because they're passive, because they're deliberate, and deliberate over time compounds. Chapter 7. The slow advantage. Impatience is basically just handing someone your leverage and asking them to use it gently. Nobody frames it that way. Impatience gets described as passion, urgency, high standards, a bias toward action. And sometimes those things are real. But underneath most impatience, if you look at it honestly, is something simpler. Discomfort with uncertainty. The situation hasn't resolved yet, and the not knowing feels intolerable, so you move. Not because the moment is right, but because waiting feels worse than doing something. That feeling is information. And it's information your counterpart is often reading more clearly than you are. This is the part of patience that people miss. It's not primarily a virtue, some admirable quality that makes you a better person. It's a strategic asset. Specifically, it's the ability to withhold information about how badly you want something, how urgently you need resolution, how much the current uncertainty is costing you. That information, once visible, shifts every dynamic in the exchange. The person who needs the situation to resolve first is the person with less leverage. Always. Experienced negotiators understand this instinctively. They don't rush. They don't signal desire. They ask questions, listen carefully, and allow the other side to fill the silence, which the other side reliably does, because their own impatience drives them to clarify, to add, to soften, to move. The negotiator who waits walks away with better terms, not because they were smarter or more forceful, but because they were more comfortable with uncertainty than the person across from them. The same principle operates in every domain where humans interact under pressure. Conflict, influence, reputation, opportunity. In every one of these contexts, the person who can afford to wait, or who appears to be able to afford it, holds a structurally different position than the person who needs resolution now. But patience does something beyond leverage management. It's also a collection mechanism. Time reveals things that the initial moment actively hides. When a situation first appears, it's almost always incomplete. The information available is partial. The motivations behind people's behavior aren't fully visible. The emotional temperature of the room is distorting everything. This is the worst possible moment to draw conclusions, and yet it's precisely when most people draw them. They react to the first version of events, form a firm impression, and commit to a position before the second and third version have had time to arrive. The patient observer waits for the later versions, and the later versions are almost always different. Think about how often a situation that seemed urgent and clear on Monday looks completely different by Thursday. New information appears. Someone's behavior turns out to have a context you weren't aware of. The person you assumed was the problem turns out to be responding to a pressure you couldn't see from your angle. The conflict that felt personal turns out to be structural. None of this was visible in the first moment. It required time to surface. Patience creates the space for that surfacing to happen before you've already committed to a response that the new information would have changed. There's another effect of patience that's rarely discussed, but worth understanding carefully. Inconsistency is very difficult to maintain over time. A narrative that's been constructed rather than simply described. A story someone is managing rather than recounting. Requires ongoing effort to keep coherent. Details need to stay aligned. Emphasis needs to stay consistent. The version told to one person needs to stay compatible with the version told to another. Under pressure, over time, this is genuinely hard. Small contradictions appear. The story shifts slightly. A detail changes. An emphasis that was heavy in the first telling becomes lighter in the third. These shifts are almost invisible in a single conversation. But to someone who has been paying attention across multiple conversations, across weeks or months, they become unmistakable. The patient observer collects these inconsistencies without announcing them. They simply notice. They file the information, and when the moment arrives where it becomes relevant, where the full picture matters, they have it. The impatient person never gets there. They reacted 3 weeks ago, before the inconsistencies had time to appear. They committed to a position based on incomplete information, and now they're defending that position rather than updating it, because updating it would require admitting they moved too fast. I've made this mistake in exactly this way, formed a strong conclusion about a situation early, acted on it, and then watched subsequent information arrive that would have significantly changed my approach if I'd waited. The situation resolved eventually, but with more friction and cost than it needed to carry, because I'd moved before the picture was complete. Patience would have cost me nothing. Impatience cost me weeks. The habit that develops from practicing patience is a changed relationship with urgency. Not indifference to urgency. Some situations genuinely require fast action, but a more calibrated response to the feeling of urgency, which is often manufactured by the situation rather than reflecting an actual deadline. Ask, when urgency appears, is this genuinely time-sensitive or does it just feel that way? Those are completely different things. Genuine time sensitivity has external constraints, a deadline, a window that closes, a decision being made by others in a fixed time frame. Manufactured urgency has no external constraint. It's entirely internal. It's the discomfort of not knowing pressing itself against your tolerance for ambiguity and demanding to be resolved. The more you practice distinguishing between these two, the less manufactured urgency controls your behavior. You begin to notice that most situations labeled urgent are actually just uncomfortable. And uncomfortable you can wait through. Patience also changes how others experience your presence in a subtle but significant way. Someone who appears to need quick resolution communicates something involuntary about their state, that they're unsettled, that the uncertainty is costing them, that they have skin in the game in ways they'd prefer not to show. Someone who appears genuinely unhurried communicates the opposite. Not coldness, not disengagement, just stability. Confidence that the situation will resolve in a workable direction. That appearance of stability, regardless of what's happening internally, changes how people approach you. They become more careful. They assume you have more information than you're sharing. They are less likely to attempt pressure tactics because those tactics require the other person to feel pressure, and you don't appear to. Some of this is performance, initially. You practice appearing unhurried before you actually feel unhurried. That's fine. Most habits begin as deliberate practice before they become natural. The patience you perform consistently eventually becomes the patience you feel, because you accumulate enough experiences of waiting and being right to trust the process viscerally rather than just intellectually. You've waited when the instinct was to move, and the waiting revealed something important. You've held back when the pressure was to react, and the pressure dissolved on its own. You've let someone else move first, and watched them reveal exactly what you needed to know. Each of those experiences builds a specific kind of trust. not in other people, but in time itself, in the process of allowing situations to develop rather than forcing them to resolve. And once you trust that process, impatience loses most of its grip. The slow advantage isn't glamorous. It doesn't produce dramatic moments or quick victories. It produces something quieter and considerably more durable. Decisions made from full information, positions that don't need to be walked back, and a reputation for being someone who doesn't rattle, which over time is worth more than almost any individual win. Move when the moment is genuinely right. Wait until it is. What your reputation is doing while you sleep. Your reputation walks into the room about 30 seconds before you do. By the time you arrive, sit down and say your first sentence. People have already made a series of quiet adjustments based on what they know, or think they know, about you. The threshold for believing what you say. The amount of benefit of the doubt they're prepared to extend. Whether your calmness reads as confidence or concealment. Whether your pushback reads as clarity or defensiveness. All of that is already calibrated before you open your mouth. This is what most people don't fully grasp about reputation. They think of it as something that comes into play during a conflict. The record you point to when you need to be believed. The history you invoke when someone questions your motives. But reputation isn't a document you retrieve when needed. It's an environment. It's operating constantly, shaping every interaction, long before any conflict arrives. And you're largely not present for most of what it does. The conversations where your reputation does its work happen without you. Someone mentions your name in a meeting you're not in. A decision gets made about whether to include you in something, and your history of behavior is the primary input. A new person asks about you and gets a description from someone who has watched you operate under pressure. None of these moments are dramatic. None of them announce themselves, but they accumulate, and their accumulation shapes the conditions of every opportunity that does or doesn't find you. This is why reputation needs to be understood as something you build actively and continuously. Not something you establish once and then rely on, and not something you only think about when it's threatened. The foundation of a strong reputation is consistency, not perfection. Nobody sustains perfection. And people who try to appear perfect trigger suspicion rather than trust. Consistency. The quality of behaving in recognizably similar ways across different conditions, different audiences, different levels of stakes. The specific thing people are watching for, usually without articulating it, is whether your behavior changes significantly based on who's watching. The version of you that appears when your boss is in the room versus when they're not. The way you speak about people when they're present versus absent. How you handle credit when there's plenty to share versus when it's scarce. How you respond to mistakes when they're yours versus when they belong to someone else. These comparisons happen automatically. People run them continuously, mostly below the level of conscious analysis. And the result is a felt sense of reliability, or its absence. Reliable people are easier to trust. Not because trust is naive, but because reliability reduces the cognitive work of predicting how someone will behave. When you know that someone is going to act similarly regardless of who's watching, you can make accurate predictions about them. And accurate predictions are the basis of real trust. The kind that holds under pressure, not just in comfortable circumstances. Unreliable people, people whose behavior shifts meaningfully depending on context, produce a different internal response in those around them. Not necessarily distrust initially, more like a low-level wariness, a slight hesitation before sharing information, a quiet reservation about how much to rely on them. These aren't conscious decisions. They're automatic adjustments to perceived unpredictability, and over time, they compound. The other major currency of reputation is how you behave under pressure. Anyone can be generous when things are going well. Anyone can appear patient when nothing is at stake. The moments that actually define how people remember you are the ones where something was genuinely difficult, where there was pressure or cost or temptation to behave worse than you did. Those moments are the ones people retell, not because they're dramatic necessarily, because they're revealing. A person who remained fair when being unfair would have benefited them. A person who acknowledged a mistake directly instead of deflecting it. A person who said something honest when saying something comfortable would have been easier. These moments create impressions that are disproportionately durable compared to the ordinary behavior that surrounds them, which means the stakes of how you behave in difficult moments are much higher than they appear in the moment itself. You're not just resolving the immediate situation. You're making a deposit or a withdrawal from an account that you'll be drawing on for years. I watched someone destroy a carefully built reputation in a single meeting. Not through one dramatic act, through a series of small ones. Under pressure, they deflected credit, blamed a colleague obliquely, overstated their own contribution, and became visibly defensive when questioned. None of these things, individually, would have registered significantly. But collectively, in a room of people who had known them as measured and fair, the contrast was stark. The reputation hadn't disappeared, but it had cracked. And once people have seen the crack, they look for it afterward. There's an aspect of reputation management that most people either misunderstand or skip entirely. Restraint in visibility. The instinct, especially in competitive environments, is to be visible. To speak often, to ensure your contributions are noticed, to make sure nobody forgets what you've done. And there's a reasonable version of this that's entirely appropriate. But pushed too far, it becomes its own liability. Constant self-promotion reads as insecurity. Frequent reminders of your accomplishments suggest you're worried people will forget them, which makes people wonder why. The person who needs to be seen as competent and the person who simply is competent behave differently, and the difference is visible. The person who is genuinely confident in their position doesn't need to constantly reinforce it. They speak when their contribution is clear and let it stand. They don't chase acknowledgement. They don't respond to every criticism as though their entire standing depends on refuting it. They have a quality of settledness that communicates something without words. I know what I bring. I don't need to convince you of it constantly. That settledness is one of the most powerful reputation signals available. It reads as security, and security reads as strength. Your reputation also functions as a kind of armor in adversarial situations. When someone with a strong, consistent reputation is criticized, the people around them bring their existing impression of that person to the evaluation. They hold the criticism up against the pattern they've observed and ask whether it fits. Often it doesn't, and the criticism loses traction. Not because it was successfully argued against, but because it doesn't match the accumulated evidence of how this person actually behaves. The person with a weak or inconsistent reputation gets no such benefit. The criticism lands in neutral territory, and people fill the ambiguity with the most available story, which is often the critic's story, because it's the only one being told. This is why reputation matters so much in conflicts you're not anticipating. You can't always prepare a defense. You can't always be present when your name comes up. But if you've built something consistent and genuine over time, the record speaks when you can't. The practical implication of all this is straightforward, but requires sustained attention. Every interaction is, in a small way, an investment, not in a transactional sense, not as a calculation of what this person can do for you later, but in the sense that how you show up accumulates. The quality of your attention, the honesty of your communication, how you handle the moments where behaving well costs you something. All of it is being quietly observed and remembered by more people than you're aware of. Most of the time, nobody is keeping score consciously, but the impressions are forming anyway. And what you're building or eroding while you're not paying attention to it is the thing that determines how much weight your words carry, how much trust you command, and how much latitude you get when you need it. Reputation is not what you say about yourself. It's the pattern of what you actually do, in the moments you think don't matter, in front of people you think aren't watching. Those people are watching. Chapter 9. How composure becomes power. You can tell who actually has authority in a room by watching who doesn't need to prove it. They're not the loudest. They're not the most aggressive. They don't interrupt frequently or dominate the physical space or make sure their opinion lands first. In fact, if you're watching the surface, volume, assertiveness, visible confidence, you might miss them entirely. They're the person who seems slightly outside the urgency of the room. Present, attentive, but not caught in it. And when they speak, something changes. Not because the words are dramatic, because the quality of attention shifts. That shift isn't accidental. It's been built, slowly, through repeated demonstrations of exactly one thing: that this person does not lose their equilibrium under pressure. That the situation, however tense, however uncertain, however charged, has not gotten inside them in the way it has gotten inside everyone else. Composure is not the same as calm. Calm can be performed. A slow voice, deliberate movements, careful word choices. Composure is something deeper. It's the internal architecture that allows you to feel the full weight of a difficult situation and still function clearly within it. Not suppressing the feeling, not pretending the pressure isn't there, but remaining operational despite it. The reason composure becomes power is structural. In any high-pressure environment, the person who retains cognitive clarity while others are losing it has access to something the others have temporarily lost: the ability to see the situation accurately. Emotional flooding, the neurological state that arrives when stress exceeds a certain threshold, narrows perception dramatically. People under emotional flooding see fewer options, process information less accurately, and become focused on the immediate threat to the exclusion of almost everything else. The composed person sees all of it. They see the immediate situation and they see around it. They notice who is reacting and why. They notice what information is being generated by other people's reactions. They notice the structure of the dynamics, while everyone else is inside the dynamics, unable to observe them. That elevated vantage point is the actual advantage. Not dominance, not force, clarity. And other people feel it. Not necessarily consciously. They probably couldn't articulate why they look toward a certain person when the room gets tense. But the nervous system registers stability the way it registers threat. It moves toward it. People who are frightened or overwhelmed naturally orient toward whoever appears to have the situation more under control. It's not a decision. It's a gravitational pull. This is why composure, over time, generates a form of authority that isn't granted by title or position. It accumulates through repeated demonstrations. Every time a situation escalates and you don't, you make a deposit. Every time someone attempts to provoke a reaction and doesn't get one, every time you respond to bad news with steady attention rather than visible alarm, all of it builds a pattern that other people internalize without quite realizing they're doing it. The inverse is equally true and worth examining. Every time someone loses their composure, visibly in front of others, they make a withdrawal from that same account. Not a fatal one necessarily. Everyone loses composure occasionally, But the withdrawal is real. People remember. They update their internal model of this person under pressure. And that updated model influences how much authority they're prepared to extend going forward. This is why emotional outbursts are so disproportionately costly relative to their actual content. A single incident of visible loss of control often costs more than months of composed behavior can rebuild. It's not fair exactly. People are complex, and a bad moment doesn't define anyone. But perception doesn't operate on fairness. It operates on vividness. Vivid negative impressions are stickier than equivalent positive ones. Understanding this asymmetry changes how you think about emotional discipline. It's not about becoming a machine. It's about recognizing that the cost of visible emotional reactivity is almost always higher than it appears in the moment. And the benefit of composure is almost always greater than it appears from the outside. The mechanics of maintaining composure under genuine pressure are worth examining practically because they're not intuitive. The natural response to threat or challenge is sympathetic activation. Faster heartbeat, narrowed attention, increased urgency. The body prepares to fight or flee. These responses are automatic and they're not wrong. In genuinely threatening physical situations, they're exactly right. But in social and professional environments, they almost never serve you. The threat isn't physical. Fighting and fleeing both destroy your position. What you need is precisely the opposite of what the body wants to provide. Developing the ability to interrupt that automatic response requires deliberate practice. The first intervention is almost always the pause. The gap between stimulus and response, even 2 or 3 seconds, is enough to prevent the automatic from becoming the actual. In that gap, a question becomes possible. What do I actually want to happen here? Not what does my nervous system want? What do I want? That question reorients the response from reactive to intentional. The second intervention is breathing, which sounds almost embarrassingly simple but is physiologically real. Slow, deliberate breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system and genuinely reduces the physical intensity of stress response. It is, in the most literal sense, a reset mechanism that's available at any moment without anyone knowing you're using it. The third intervention is perspective shift. The question, will this matter in a year? Not always. Sometimes the answer is yes, and then the stakes feel appropriate. But very often the answer is no. And no changes the body's interpretation of the threat. What felt like an emergency becomes, with accurate perspective, a difficult moment in a larger timeline. Difficult moments don't require emergency responses. There is a subtler dimension of composure that's worth sitting with. It's not just about managing your own reactions. It's about what your composure does to the environment around you. When one person in a room maintains genuine stability, while others are escalating, the dynamic shifts in a specific way. The escalation loses a partner. Conflict, like fire, requires oxygen. It needs both parties to be generating heat. When one party becomes genuinely still, the fire has nowhere to spread. The person who was escalating finds themselves in an odd position, performing intensity at someone who isn't performing anything back. That asymmetry is uncomfortable. And discomfort, in the person who initiated the escalation, often produces exactly what you'd want it to produce: a de-escalation. Not because they decided to be reasonable, because the social geometry stopped working. I spent a long time believing that composure meant suppression, that staying calm in difficult situations meant forcing the feeling underground and pretending it wasn't there. That understanding was wrong, and it made the practice much harder than it needed to be. What actually works is different. It's acknowledgement without amplification. You feel the frustration, the anger, the discomfort, fully, honestly. But you don't feed it with attention. You don't let the narrative around the feeling build. You note the emotion and return to the situation. The feeling moves through instead of getting stuck. Over time, this practice changes your relationship with pressure in a fundamental way. Situations that once triggered strong reactive responses begin to feel different. Not smaller, the stakes may be identical, but more navigable. The pressure arrives, and you notice it, and you remain functional within it. Because you've accumulated enough experience of that being possible to trust it. And that trust, the embodied knowledge that you can handle what arrives without losing yourself, is the deepest form of composure. Not a performance of stability, but an actual relationship with it. The person who has that relationship is very difficult to destabilize. Not impossible, but difficult. And in environments where destabilization is a primary tactic, where people use emotional provocation to gain advantage, where manufactured urgency and visible conflict are tools, difficult to destabilize is the same as hard to beat. Composure doesn't guarantee outcomes. Nothing guarantees outcomes. But it consistently improves the quality of your decisions, the clarity of your perception, and the authority you carry in rooms where others are losing theirs. In the long run, that compounds into something quietly formidable. Chapter 10. When they finally see you clearly. The most interesting thing about being underestimated is what people accidentally tell you while they're doing it. They tell you how they evaluate people, what signals they use, what they consider impressive and what they dismiss. They show you their entire framework for sorting human beings into categories of worth, and they do it completely unguarded, because they've already decided which category you belong in, and they're not worried about you noticing. This is one of the stranger gifts available in social environments. It arrives disguised as a slight. Underestimation happens for all kinds of reasons. You're new. You're quiet. You don't perform confidence in the ways the environment rewards. You don't network aggressively or speak first in meetings or make sure your contributions are loudly attributed. You do the work without building a parallel campaign to ensure everyone knows you're doing the work. And in environments that read those signals as indicators of capability, your absence of performance gets interpreted as absence of substance. So people talk around you. They explain things to you that you already understand better than they do. They make decisions in your vicinity without considering your input. They include you just enough to maintain appearances and exclude you just enough to keep the real conversation somewhere else. And the entire time, you're watching. This is the part that people who have been underestimated understand, and people who haven't don't. The informational windfall that comes with being dismissed. When people don't think you're tracking, they stop curating what you see. They stop performing. The version of themselves they manage carefully in high-stakes interactions gets replaced by something considerably more honest. Their actual opinions surface. Their real dynamics become visible. The gap between what they say publicly and what they do privately opens up and stays open. The person who is underestimated, and who has the patience and self-possession to simply observe rather than immediately correcting the misperception, accumulates an intelligence advantage that is almost impossible to replicate through any other means. You learn who actually makes decisions versus who performs decision-making. You learn whose relationships are genuine and whose are entirely transactional. You learn who deflects under pressure and who becomes more honest. You learn the architecture of the environment, who defers to whom, who is actually trusted versus publicly celebrated, where the real conversations happen and where the performed ones do. None of this is available to people who are immediately visible and immediately evaluated. The highly visible person gets the curated version of everyone around them. You get the unedited one. The question is whether you can tolerate the discomfort of the in-between period long enough to let it be useful. That discomfort is real. Being underestimated carries a specific kind of friction. The low-grade irritation of watching people make incorrect assumptions about you and having to decide repeatedly not to correct them. The social instinct to establish yourself, to ensure people see you accurately, is strong. It feels like self-respect to correct a misperception. It can feel like complicity to let it stand, but letting it stand, strategically, is often the more powerful choice. Because the moment you correct the misperception, the moment you signal that you've been tracking everything, that you understand the dynamics better than people assumed, the information flow changes. People become careful again. The unguarded version retreats. You lose access to the honest layer and get handed the managed one instead. The reveal, when it comes, should come on your terms. Not as a correction of the record, not as a defense, as a demonstration. At a moment of your choosing, in a context where it actually matters, where the quality of your understanding becomes simply and quietly apparent. I watched someone execute this almost perfectly over the course of about 8 months. She was new to an organization with a deeply established hierarchy, the kind of place where seniority was treated as a proxy for intelligence, and newcomers were expected to observe for a long time before contributing. She observed, asked questions that seemed simple but weren't, said very little in large meetings, accumulated an understanding of the organization's dynamics that nobody realized she was building. Then, in a single presentation, the right moment, the right audience, the right stakes, she demonstrated that understanding completely, not aggressively, just accurately. The room's recalibration was visible in real time, not dramatic, just suddenly, irreversibly different. The underestimation period had been a gift she'd had the patience to unwrap carefully. There's a psychological dimension to this worth examining. How you experience being underestimated reveals something important about where your sense of identity lives. If your self-worth is primarily located in how others perceive you, if being seen accurately feels necessary for your own internal stability, then being dismissed will feel threatening in a way that makes patience nearly impossible. The need to correct the misperception becomes urgent because the misperception itself feels destabilizing. But if your sense of self is located somewhere more internal, in your own clear-eyed assessment of your capabilities, in the quality of your thinking, regardless of whether it's being recognized, then the misperception becomes manageable. It's not pleasant, but it's survivable without immediate correction. And surviving it, with your equilibrium intact, is what allows the observation period to be useful. This is connected to something that runs through every chapter of this book: the relationship between internal stability and external effectiveness. The person who needs external validation to feel stable is always vulnerable to having that validation withheld. Their behavior can be influenced by the threat of being seen badly, the promise of being seen well. Someone who understands this about them has a reliable lever. The person who has developed genuine internal stability, not arrogance, not indifference to how they're perceived, but a solid enough foundation that external misperception doesn't collapse their sense of self, is structurally different. They can afford to wait. They can afford to be misread temporarily. They can make decisions based on what's actually right, rather than what will be immediately recognized as right. That freedom, the freedom to be temporarily invisible without being destabilized by it, is one of the most undervalued strategic assets available. Because the person who doesn't need to be seen immediately is the person who gets to choose when they're seen. And choosing the moment of your own visibility, appearing clearly, at full capacity, at the time and in the context of your choosing, is a qualitatively different experience than scrambling to be recognized continuously, in every interaction, at whatever level of readiness the moment finds you. The underestimation period ends. It always ends. People update their models eventually. Reality has a way of asserting itself regardless of initial impressions. The question is only what you've built during the interval, and whether you're ready when the picture finally comes into focus. Be ready. Shaktan Chapter 11, The Mirror Problem. Type continue when ready. Chapter 11, The Mirror Problem. Every manipulator needs a lever. Most people hand theirs over voluntarily, wrapped in something that feels like a personality trait. That's the part that's hard to sit with. The idea that the things most likely to be used against you aren't weaknesses you've hidden or failures you're ashamed of. They're the parts of yourself you've never examined because they feel like just who you are. Your need to be right. Your sensitivity to being dismissed. Your discomfort with conflict. Your hunger for approval from specific kinds of people. Your inability to tolerate being misunderstood without immediately correcting it. These aren't character flaws exactly, they're patterns. And patterns, once visible to someone paying attention, become entirely predictable. Predictable becomes exploitable. Not necessarily by someone with a sophisticated plan, often just by someone who has spent enough time around you to notice what reliably moves you. The hardest part of strategic thinking isn't learning to read other people. Most people, given enough motivation, can develop reasonable skill at reading others. The harder problem is developing an accurate picture of yourself. Specifically, where are the gaps between how you see your own behavior and how it actually appears? Where are the triggers you've rationalized into virtues? Where are the needs you've never named that are nonetheless shaping your decisions? This is the mirror problem, not the mirror of how you present yourself. Most people have a reasonably accurate picture of their surface. The mirror that shows you what's operating underneath the surface, in the automatic responses you've never interrogated, in the reactions that feel completely justified in the moment and are probably costing you something you haven't accounted for. Start with your reliable reactions. The things that consistently produce a strong internal response. Defensiveness, urgency, the need to act immediately. These are the most useful starting points because reliability is the signal. A reaction that happens once might be situational. A reaction that happens every time a particular kind of event occurs is a pattern. And patterns have causes worth understanding. What specifically triggers your defensiveness? Not the surface content. Someone criticized your work. Someone questioned your judgment. But the deeper structure. Is it being questioned publicly versus privately? Is it being questioned by certain kinds of people? Is it the implication of incompetence or the implication of bad intent? The more precisely you can locate the actual source of the reaction, the more clearly you can see what it's protecting. Because defensiveness is always protecting something. Some version of self-image that feels threatened by the trigger. And whatever that something is, your sense of competence, your sense of fairness, your sense of being seen accurately, is exactly what someone who wants to destabilize you will aim at. Not because they've done a careful psychological analysis, because they've noticed, empirically, that this is where you react. The need to be right is worth examining with particular care, because it disguises itself so effectively as a virtue. Accuracy matters. Intellectual honesty matters. Caring about truth is genuinely important. But the need to be right, the emotional requirement that your correctness be acknowledged, that the record be set straight, that the other person update their position visibly and completely, is different. It's not really about truth. It's about something that feels like dignity, but functions more like ego maintenance. And it is one of the most reliable levers available. Present someone who needs to be right with a situation where they're being publicly misrepresented, and watch what happens. The need to correct it overwhelms almost everything else. Strategy, timing, audience, cost, all of it gets temporarily suspended because the misrepresentation is intolerable in a way that bypasses analysis. The person who created that situation didn't need to do anything else. The reaction did the work. I have a specific version of this that took me an embarrassingly long time to recognize in myself. A particular kind of dismissal, being treated as less informed than I actually was, by someone who hadn't done the work to actually evaluate my understanding, produced a reaction that was disproportionate to the actual stakes. Not visible mostly, but internal. A strong pull toward proving the dismissal wrong, toward demonstrating the gap between their assumption and reality, toward making the correction clear enough that it couldn't be ignored. It was only when I noticed that certain people seemed to produce this reaction in me reliably, and that the situations where I felt most compelled to prove myself were often the situations where I was least effective, that I started to understand what was actually happening. The dismissal wasn't threatening my position. My reaction to it was, once you've identified a pattern, the work is not to eliminate it. That's the wrong goal. Patterns rooted in genuine values, caring about accuracy, wanting to be seen fairly, needing to operate with integrity, aren't meant to be removed. They're meant to be understood well enough that they stop running automatically. The distinction is between a value and a trigger. A value is something you've chosen, that you act on deliberately, that you can modulate based on context and stakes. A trigger is something that acts on you, that produces a response before you've had time to evaluate whether the response serves anything. The same underlying thing, say caring deeply about accuracy, can function as either. As a value, it produces careful thinking, well-timed corrections, the patience to let the right moment arrive before addressing a misrepresentation. As a trigger, it produces immediate, automatic correction, regardless of timing, audience, or cost. The difference is the pause, the gap between stimulus and response where the evaluation can happen. You feel the pull of the reaction, and in that moment, you ask, is responding to this right now actually what I'd choose if I were choosing deliberately? Or is this the trigger running its automatic program? This question doesn't always produce the same answer. Sometimes the trigger and the deliberate choice align perfectly. Yes, this needs to be addressed, now, in this way. Sometimes they diverge sharply. The value of the question is not that it changes the response. It's that it makes the response a choice rather than an automatic. There's another dimension of the mirror problem that receives almost no attention. The ego needs that shape your strategic decisions without appearing to. Not obvious ego, the need for credit, for recognition, for status. Those are visible enough that most people have at least some awareness of them. The subtler ones. The need to be the person who identified a problem first. The need to be known as someone who doesn't get manipulated. The need to maintain a specific self-narrative, strategic, perceptive, not easily fooled. These needs are harder to see because they're tangled up with identity. And when a decision serves both your genuine strategic interest and your need to maintain a particular self-image, it's very difficult to tell which one is actually driving it. The way to test it is to imagine a scenario where the two diverge, where the genuinely strategic choice would require you to appear uncertain, or to let someone else take credit, or to acknowledge that you missed something, or to be seen as having been influenced when your self-narrative says you're not easily influenced. In that scenario, which way do you move? Toward what actually serves the situation, or toward protecting the image, Most people, if honest, move toward the image more often than they realize. Not dramatically, in small ways. A slight overstating of confidence to avoid appearing uncertain. A slightly slower acknowledgement of a mistake than the situation warranted. A slightly more defensive response to a reasonable criticism than was necessary. Each individual instance is minor. The cumulative effect is a pattern of decisions that serve self-image more than strategic interest. And that pattern is visible from the outside to people who are paying attention. The goal of this kind of self-examination isn't to become perfectly self-aware. That's not achievable, and the pursuit of it becomes its own distortion. The goal is accurate enough, clear enough that your patterns aren't running your decisions without your knowledge. Present enough to your own triggers that you can feel them activate and choose whether to follow them. Because the person who knows their own levers is the person who controls them, and the person who controls their own levers cannot be easily moved by someone else pulling them. That's not a small thing. In environments where people are constantly, if unconsciously, probing for what moves you, learning your patterns, testing your reactions, filing away what produces a response and what doesn't. Being genuinely difficult to lever is one of the most durable advantages available. It doesn't require becoming someone different. It requires understanding who you already are, with enough clarity that you're the one deciding when your patterns run and when they don't. Know your levers before someone else does. Chapter 12. The Long Game. The most dangerous person in any room isn't the loudest. It's the one who already knows how this ends. Not because they're smarter, not because they have more information, but because they're operating on a different timeline than everyone else. While others are responding to what's happening right now, this comment, this conflict, this moment of pressure, the long game thinker is asking a different question entirely. Not what do I do here, but where does this situation end up? And what position do I want to be in when it does? That shift in temporal orientation changes everything about how you behave in the short term. The long game isn't a strategy exactly. It's a frame. A way of holding present situations inside a larger context so that immediate pressures don't collapse your perspective into the purely reactive. It's the difference between playing the move in front of you and playing the board 3 moves from now. Both require attention to the current position, but only one of them produces decisions that still look good when the situation has fully developed. Most people play short, not because they lack intelligence or intention, because short is easier, short is immediate. Short provides feedback quickly. You react, something happens, you can see whether it worked. The loop is tight and satisfying. Long game thinking has a much longer feedback loop. You make a decision that won't be validated for months. You absorb a short-term cost for a long-term position. You tolerate looking passive when you're actually being strategic. The feedback is delayed and sometimes never fully arrives because you can't always observe the counterfactual. What would have happened if you'd played short instead? This is why the long game is genuinely hard. It asks you to trust a process whose results are mostly invisible until they're suddenly not. But the results do arrive, and when they do, they tend to be disproportionate. Here's what long game thinking actually looks like in practice. Someone challenges you publicly in a way that's unfair. The short game response is to correct the record immediately, visibly, in the same forum. The long game response is to note who was present, evaluate whether the misrepresentation will actually stick, consider whether immediate correction helps your position or simply amplifies the moment, and act based on that analysis rather than the feeling of urgency. Sometimes the long game response and the short game response are identical. Sometimes you should correct it immediately. But the key difference is that the long game thinker makes that choice deliberately, after evaluation, not automatically in response to the emotional pull of the situation. The situations that most reward long-game thinking are conflicts. Not the large, obvious conflicts where the stakes are clear and everyone knows a decision needs to be made. The small, ambiguous ones. The ones that could be resolved quickly or allowed to develop. Where the instinct is to push for quick resolution, but the actual value is in watching what happens if you wait. Conflicts have trajectories. They don't stay static. The people involved continue to behave, and behavior over time reveals things that the initial confrontation doesn't. Motivations become clearer. Inconsistencies surface. The narrative that seemed solid begins to show its construction. Allies shift. New information appears. All of this is happening constantly in the background of any sustained conflict. And the person who allows time to do its work often finds that the situation has resolved itself in their favor without requiring any dramatic intervention. The person who pushed for quick resolution got a quick resolution. The person who waited got a better one. There's a specific quality of mind that long-game thinking develops over time. It's a kind of equanimity about short-term outcomes, not indifference, but the ability to absorb temporary setbacks without treating them as permanent. To lose a round without losing the match. To be misunderstood today without catastrophizing about what that means for your position tomorrow. This equanimity is deeply uncomfortable to develop because it requires letting go of the need for immediate vindication. The human desire to be understood correctly, right now, by the people in front of you, is powerful. Overriding, choosing instead to let your actions accumulate over time and make your case for you, requires a tolerance for short-term discomfort that doesn't come naturally. But the payoff is significant. Because the person who doesn't need immediate vindication can't be controlled by the withholding of it. The tactic of creating situations where you feel publicly questioned, where your position seems uncertain, where you feel pressure to prove yourself quickly. That tactic only works if you need quick resolution. Remove that need, and the tactic has nothing to grab. I have watched people lose positions they deserved to hold because they played every small conflict as though it were the final battle. They won many of those conflicts. They were often right. But the cumulative cost of constant engagement, the energy depleted, the enemies accumulated, the reputation as someone who fights about everything, eventually outweighed the individual victories. The war was won in pieces and lost in total. Long-game thinking would have changed the calculus entirely. Not every conflict needs to be won. Some conflicts are better walked away from, because walking away preserves resources for the situations that actually matter. Some battles are better lost gracefully, because the manner of losing builds more credibility than the winning would have. Some positions are better held quietly over time than defended loudly in the moment. The long game also changes how you think about relationships. Short-term relationship management is transactional. Who can help me now? Who do I need access to currently? Who is useful in this immediate situation? Long-term relationship thinking is different. It's interested in genuine quality, in who operates with integrity when integrity has a cost, in who remains consistent when circumstances change, in who proves over time to be worth trusting with the things that matter. These people are rare, and identifying them, which takes time, because it requires watching how people behave across different situations and different levels of stakes, is one of the highest return investments available. A relationship built on genuine mutual respect and demonstrated reliability over years is worth more than any number of transactional connections built quickly on shared immediate interest. Because when things actually get difficult, when the situation is genuinely high stakes and the pressure is real, the person you want in your corner is not the one who was convenient. It's the one who showed you, over time, who they actually are. There is one more dimension of long-game thinking that rarely gets discussed because it's the most uncomfortable to examine. It involves your relationship with your own legacy, not in a grand, historical sense, but in the smaller, more immediate sense of what you are building through the accumulation of your daily decisions. Every interaction contributes something to a larger pattern. Every choice about whether to react or observe, whether to engage or conserve, whether to seek immediate recognition or allow the work to accumulate quietly, all of it is building something. The question is whether you're building it deliberately or accidentally. Most people build accidentally. They respond to whatever the immediate environment demands, accumulate the consequences of those responses, and periodically look back at where they've ended up with varying degrees of satisfaction. The pattern that emerges is real. It reflects genuine choices, but it was never consciously designed. It just happened. Deliberate building is different. It starts with a clear sense of what you're actually trying to create. Not just what outcomes you want in individual situations, but what kind of presence you want to have developed over time. What you want to be known for, not in a reputational management sense, but in the deeper sense of what you want your accumulated behavior to have actually demonstrated. That clarity functions as a decision filter. When a situation arrives and the short game response and the long game response diverge, you have something to consult beyond your immediate feelings about the situation. You have a direction. And directions make individual decisions considerably easier because you're not evaluating each one from scratch. You're asking a simpler question. Does this move toward what I'm building or away from it? This is what the long game ultimately produces. Not just better strategic outcomes in individual situations, a different quality of presence in the world. You become less reactive, less rattled by temporary setbacks, less susceptible to tactics designed to destabilize you quickly, less concerned with how you appear in any single moment, and more concerned with the pattern you're building over time. Other people begin to experience you differently, not dramatically. The shift is gradual. But over months and years, something becomes visible. You don't panic when situations get complicated. You don't abandon your position when pressure increases. You don't need to be the loudest voice or the most immediately impressive. You're consistent in a way that accumulates into something. And that something, the quiet credibility of someone who has demonstrated repeatedly over time that they can be trusted to think clearly under pressure and act with integrity when it costs something, is extraordinarily difficult to replicate quickly. You cannot manufacture it. You cannot perform it convincingly for very long. You can only build it slowly, through the accumulation of small decisions made well in moments that felt like they barely mattered. The long game is won mostly in those moments. Pay attention to them. You can't control how people behave, but you can become someone they find very difficult to manipulate. That's the quiet promise underneath everything in this book. Not that you'll win every conflict. Not that people will stop being complicated, or self-interested, or occasionally unfair. They will. Human nature doesn't change because you understand it better. What changes is your relationship to it. The difference between being inside the chaos and being able to see it clearly enough to move through it with intention. What we've covered here isn't a system. It's a way of paying attention. You learn to see the hidden layer, the ambition, insecurity, and status protection that quietly shape behavior in every social environment. You learned why intelligent people are often the most emotionally reactive, and why that reactivity costs them precisely when clarity matters most. You learned to read what people aren't saying, the behavior under pressure, the gaps between stated values and actual choices, The small, unguarded moments that tell you more than any careful presentation ever could. You learn to recognize manipulation not as dramatic villainy, but as ordinary mechanics. Doubt introduced quietly, narratives framed selectively, emotional contrast engineered to make one person appear stable and another appear unhinged. You learned that silence isn't absence, that choosing your battles is resource management, not passivity, that patience is an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as waiting. You learned that your reputation is working constantly in rooms you'll never enter, and that what it says about you depends almost entirely on how you behave in moments you've already forgotten. You learned that composure isn't suppression. It's the internal architecture that keeps you functional when everything around you is designed to make you react. You learned that being underestimated is a gift if you have the patience to use it correctly. And you learned that the hardest mirror to look into is the one that shows you your own levers, the patterns and needs that feel like personality, but function like vulnerabilities. None of this turns you into someone cold, or cynical, or calculating in the hollow, exhausting way that word usually implies. What it does is give you options. The reactive person has one option: respond to what just happened, with whatever emotional energy the moment produces. The aware person has several. They can respond, they can observe, they can wait, they can redirect, they can choose the moment, the manner, and the degree of their engagement. That range of available choices is the practical definition of strategic freedom. The silent strategist isn't silent because they have nothing to say. They're silent because they've learned the difference between speaking and communicating, and they've chosen to do the latter, carefully, when it actually matters. This takes time to build. There will be situations where you react before you've had time to think, where the trigger runs its program before you catch it, where you play short when the long game would have served you better. That's not failure. That's the process. Every moment you catch the pattern, even after the fact, even in retrospect, is a moment that makes the next catch slightly faster. The goal isn't perfection, it's direction. Move in the right direction, consistently, and the accumulation does the rest. You cannot control how others behave, but you can control how you respond. And the moment you develop that discipline, genuinely, not as performance, the game changes completely. Not because the game gets easier, because you finally understand how it's played.